My last pencast, we looked at the two methods of coming up with the bad debt expense entry. Now I would like to focus a little more time on one of those methods, the percent of accounts receivable method. In our first pencast, we said we had accounts receivable of $10,000. We expected 10%. We had accounts receivable, $20,000. Let's get that right. We thought 10% would go bad. So we wanted the balance in the allowance account to be $2,000. That was step one. Step two was to figure out where we were in the allowance account and make that happen. We had a $100 credit balance. We want to end up at $2,000. So our entry was $1,900. And the bad debt estimate at the end of the period adjusting entry would reflect that bad debt expense allowance for doubtful accounts. The amount of the entry, $1,900, with the ending result, leaving the allowance account where you would want it to be. Let's try another approach. In this approach, let's say the allowance for doubtful accounts was not a $100 credit balance, but it was in fact a $100 debit balance. Would that affect our journal entry? The answer is yes. In step one, we still need to calculate what we want the account balance to be. We have $20,000 in accounts receivable. We think the allowance should be $2,000, so based on a 10% estimate, that's still our goal in step one. Step two, I finished circling my steps, did you notice? The last problem. Step two for this problem would be figure out where we are. The allowance for doubtful accounts has a $100 debit balance. We would like it to be a $2,000 credit balance. How much do you need to credit this account to get it from a debit of $100 to a credit of $2,000? We need $100 to get it to $0, and then another $2,000 to get it up to where we need it to be. So in this example, we would credit it for $2,100. A debit of $100, a credit of $2,100 lands at a credit of $200. So if you had a debit balance to start with, you would need to consider that. And the entry in this example would be bad debt. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Bad debt expense of $2,100 and allowance for doubtful accounts of $2,100. And when that is posted, $2,100, it ends up with the balance you want in the allowance account of $2,000. So this wasn't really a different step I was showing you. What I was showing you was specifically how to calculate if the balance in the allowance account at the end of the period before the adjusting entry is a credit or a debit. It's impossible to say what it will be. You'll set the estimate up at the end of one period, you'll write things off, and you'll end up with a balance. It could be a small debit or it could be a small credit if your initial estimate was good. You need to consider that when you make your journal entry under the percent of accounts receivable method, so that you make your resulting journal entry considering that beginning balance correctly. Thanks for joining me for this short pencast on how the beginning balance in the allowance for doubtful accounts affects the resulting bad debt estimate under the percent of sales method.